You're listening to In Clear Focus, fresh perspectives on the business of advertising, produced weekly by Bigeye. Hello, I'm your host, Adrian Tennant, VP of Insight at Bigeye, an audience-focused, creative-driven, full-service advertising agency. We're based in Orlando, Florida, but serve clients across the United States and beyond. Thank you for joining us. A digital media research report, the Infinite Dial 2020, shows that 75% of people in the US are familiar with the concept of podcasting. That's up from 70% in 2019. And over half of the US population aged 12 and above, 55%, have listened to a podcast, with around 37% listening in the last month. The last 12 months have witnessed significant growth in podcast listening, with several industry deals signaling the growing importance of the medium to marketers and advertisers. Spotify, which has made a major push into podcasts, now boasts more than 1 million podcast titles and has been adding to its catalogue by signing exclusive partnerships, including a multi-year deal with Joe Rogan worth around $100 million. Also joining Spotify in an exclusive deal is reality TV star Kim Kardashian West, who will host a podcast investigating the case of Kevin Keith, convicted of 3 murders in 1994 and sentenced to execution in Ohio. And just this week, Spotify announced that it's rolling out a video feature for its podcasts, letting creators bring both audio and video content to the app. Will podcasts become a more TV-like experience? And if so, how might that change how we consume podcasts? Spotify certainly seems intent on becoming the Netflix of audio content. Not wishing to be outdone, SiriusXM, a company most well known for its satellite radio channels and which also owns Pandora, is buying the podcasting company Stitcher from Scripps. That deal is said to be worth $325 million. And almost every week, it seems, we're learning about new podcast-focused advertising and attribution platforms. So, what are your favourite podcasts? Let us know by taking a short listener survey on the In Clear Focus page at bigeyeagency.com under Insights. Just click on the button marked Podcast. Please submit your thoughts about podcasts, where you listen, and the kind of content you'd like to hear more of in future episodes of this show. Okay, back to our regularly scheduled programming. It's the time of year when we typically think about vacations, but of course this year is far from normal. So whether you're planning a summer road trip, a staycation, or just need a break from your routine, members of the Bigeye team are here to share their favourite podcasts for your listening consideration.
I'm Rhett Withy. I'm the senior designer at Bigeye, and I've been here for 7 years now.
Excellent. Rhett, can you tell us a little bit about what you do here at Bigeye?
Let's see. Well, I work with the creative director, Seth, on executing campaigns, logos, pretty much anything design and creative under the sun for our clients, and creative problem solving as well.
Excellent. So how long have you been listening to podcasts?
Wow. I would probably say right around the time that podcasts really started getting popular. I think it was like 2013, 2014, somewhere around there.
What's your preferred device for listening to podcasts?
I actually always almost exclusively listen to podcasts at my desk on my desktop.
So do you have a particular favorite genre, would you say?
I would definitely say that it's pop culture and it's sports and it's nerd stuff.
So Rhett has selected an episode of a show called 83 Weeks with Eric Bischoff. And I must confess that I didn't know who Eric Bischoff was, so you might need to explain that in a second. But the subtitle of the show is Fall Brawl 1998, in parenthesis, Warrior, in WCW, close parenthesis. You've got to explain, what is this show about?
All right, there's a lot to unpack here, and I wouldn't feel bad that you don't know who that is, because probably 90% of the population is not going to know. It's very insider. Eric Bischoff is the man that ran World Championship Wrestling in the mid-90s and brought them to prominence and took over the #1 rating spot from World Wrestling Federation at the time for 83 weeks. They had the number one show for 83 weeks, which is the name of the podcast. Fall Brawl 98 is a specific pay-per-view event that they had. And the Ultimate Warrior was a wrestler that they brought in that was completely horrendous for what they were doing at the time and was pretty much the catalyst for them to no longer be number one.
Rhett, what stood out to you about this particular episode?
Well, the whole series is interesting because it's kind of putting Eric Bischoff under a microscope and making him confess to his crimes, right? So this particular one was interesting just because of bringing in, and his explanation of bringing in this wrestler, the Ultimate Warrior, who is so polarizing even today, and why he thought that was a good idea, and knowing that show and how much of a train wreck that pay-per-view actually was, like hearing his explanations for things and why he went certain routes and trying to kind of listen to like, I think you're still covering your butt there, was really fascinating.
Right. Now, what was it about this particular episode that made it worthy of your recommendation?
It really is it's the Eric's trying to come to grips with, especially knowing now how much of a terrible person the Ultimate Warrior was, and him trying to rectify his choices but still trying to come off clean in a sense. So it's really an interesting listen to hear how he is trying to explain himself and trying to make everything seem not as bad as it actually was.
Rhett, thank you very much indeed for joining us on In Clear Focus today.
Thanks, Adrian. It's been great.
Hi, I'm Lauren Four. I am the executive assistant to our owner and the leadership team, which can be a variety of different things based on the day, the quarter, the need. And also I help with a lot of internal marketing initiatives as well, blogs, things like that.
Lauren, how long have you been listening to podcasts?
So the podcast that got me into podcasts, which I would venture to say is probably the one that got a lot of people into podcasts, was called Serial. Back in 2013, 2014. That's cereal as in serial killer, not Fruit Loops, right? Just to clarify. Yeah. Every episode, it just sucked you in and you had to listen to the next and the next and the next. And it was just incredible. So I had not listened to a podcast before that. And I didn't listen to too many after, actually, but that was the one that really got me into it. And I think a lot of people.
So, Lauren, you selected the TED Radio Hour from NPR, and the show title is What Makes Us Us. So what is the show about?
So we're introduced to essentially 4 speakers, and they all have given TED Talks in the past. So first we hear from Sam Sternberg, who studies gene editing technology. And he talks about the letters of DNA, so A, G, C, T. And each human has 3.2 billion of these letters. And if you were going to fill up a dictionary with all of them, it would be 800 dictionaries per person. And then he talks about this gene editing tool called CRISPR-Cas9 that he has been working on. And he says, if you wanted to go into said dictionary, just as an example, and eliminate the few letters that make you a morning person versus not a morning person, or the shape of your nose, or if you have Parkinson's disease, it's like your genes are responsible for everything and everything can really be isolated, but it's a needle in a haystack. So this CRISPR-Cas9 tool is letting scientists basically go in and try to pinpoint where these different things are. Now, he does note the caveat that it hasn't been conducted in an actual human. It's been conducted in human cells in a petri dish. So we should make that clear. But he does say that there's hope that one day we could potentially do this in humans. And then there's the argument of, well, do you want to do that? Are you messing with natural selection at that point? How much do we want to mess with that? So he talks a little bit about that. And then we hear from Steven Pinker, who is a Harvard professor in psychology. And he talks about our circuitry in the brain, but also the nature versus nurture argument. So are we all born as blank slates? And if so, he talks about social engineering, could we engineer a certain type of humankind? if we're all born the same. So he kind of talks about the nature versus nurture debate. And then he talks about identical twins and this experiment they did. So identical twins that grew up in different parts of the world. So one was raised Catholic in, I want to say Germany. The other was raised Jewish in, I want to say Trinidad. So they bring them into this lab in Minneapolis. And again, they've never met. They're wearing the same shirt, same navy shirt with the same epaulette. Then they start realizing that they both wear rubber bands around their wrist. They flush the toilet before and after using it. They dip their toast in coffee, all these little things. And it's like, these are two people who have never met, grew up in completely different environments, but they have the same genes. So there are arguments for both sides, but he goes into that. So that was really interesting to me. It's so deep.
Now, what made this particular episode a favorite for you?
I think that this was one of the first ones that I listened to, and this was probably one of the deeper ones that got me really hooked on the series.
So you would give this a strong recommendation for listeners?
Very strong.
Give a sample.
If you want your mind blown.
Yeah. Okay. Perfect. All right. Lauren, thank you so much for being on In Clear Focus.
Yes. Thanks so much for having me. It was fun.
Let's take a short break. We'll be right back after this message.
I'm Eric McGrew, designer at Bigeye. Every week, In Clear Focus addresses topics that impact our work as advertising and design professionals. At Bigeye, we put audiences first. For every engagement, we develop a deep understanding of our clients' prospects and customers. By conducting our own research, we're able to capture customers' attitudes, behaviors, and motivations. This data is distilled into actionable insights that inspire creative brand building and persuasive activation campaigns, and guide strategic, cost-effective media placements that really connect. If you'd like to know more about how to put Bigeye's audience-focused, creative-driven insights to work for your brand, please contact us. Email info@bigeyeagency.com. Bigeye, reaching the right people in the right place at the right time.
Welcome back. We're talking about some of the Bigeye team's favorite podcasts.
Hi, I'm Nick Hammond. I am a graphic designer here at Bigeye.
Nick, could you tell us a little bit about your role here at Bigeye?
Yes, so my role here at Bigeye, while some of the other designers are more focused on specific tasks, I guess, in relation to illustration and motion graphics, mine is more so on the side of branding. So I work on pulling across elements throughout different end uses, such as digital and print and social and things of the like.
So Nick, how long have you been listening to podcasts?
I think I've been listening to podcasts for a while. It has to have been several years at this point. I think for me, it was my intro to podcasts was through the Joe Rogan experience. And that was kind of when he had first started doing more stuff on YouTube. And there was more of the video element there. And that was kind of the only one I was listening to for a very long time. That was kind of before I even really knew what the podcast format was. And then, yeah, it kind of splintered into other smaller podcasts, just kind of listening one off here and there. So it was nothing like I wasn't looking for specific podcasts. It was more so something would pop up in my feed that would be interesting and I would go look for it and then happen to stumble onto a podcast that was in relation to some topic I was interested in.
What app do you typically use?
I started with Stitcher, which is funny because when I've talked to the other guests that you've had on, they had no idea what Stitcher even was. So I think for them, they got into it through Apple. I never enjoyed, from a design perspective, the user interface of the Apple podcast platform. And it felt like it was getting in the way for me of just trying to listen to a simple episode. And it was constantly trying to update and change and all this stuff. And I just didn't want to deal with it. So yeah, I ended up getting Stitcher. And then a couple of the podcasts that I was listening to more often started promoting that platform a little more when it had started. And that was primarily what I was using on the phone.
And is that still the case today, or have you migrated to something else?
I do prefer, there's something interesting to me about being able to see how people are interacting. So like a video aspect. So when I'm listening on a desktop, I like to have, if it's on YouTube, I like to have a YouTube thing kind of playing, because it's interesting when you hear different aspects of a conversation show up, to kind of pull up that window on the browser and look at how they're interacting with each other, because there's something there that you don't get when you're just listening to the audio.
Right. You get the audio, but you don't always get the visual context of facial expressions. Yeah, that kind of stuff. So, Nick, your selection for this episode of In Clear Focus is an episode of a show called Revisionist History. Could you tell us a little bit about how you came across that podcast?
Yeah, so I had been not necessarily a fan, but a reader of Malcolm Gladwell in the past. And there was some stuff in there that I enjoyed, and I've always enjoyed reading more psychology or biography type stuff. And so I'd been through a couple of his books and had heard his name a while and had kind of gotten to some other authors like him. And I think there was someone that had posted one of his newer episodes from the Revisionist History, and I had realized that I had never heard it, and I didn't know that he had came out with podcasts. So yeah, I just dove in. Okay,
so this particular episode that you picked, what was it about this one that attracted you?
Yeah, this episode in particular, I, as a designer and as a Gemini, which is funny, I feel like my life is kind of separated into two buckets all the time, and it's always this push-pull thing. And so it was interesting to me because they dive into the difference between approaching some sort of task or situation with a tortoise or a hare kind of mentality, and this, how are you thinking through tasks either more quickly or more slowly, and then does that end up influencing your direction in life? They talk a lot about in the episode about education and kind of higher education reform, and that wasn't what was interesting to me. It was more so the different thought processes of how people go into these situations and approach them from completely different perspectives.
Right, and I think if any of the listeners have friends or family that are in the legal profession, I think some of the results, without wanting to give too much away, might be surprising, right?
Definitely. And I didn't want to give it away, but yes, listen to the episode.
So Nick, what made this episode of Revisionist History a favorite?
So without giving away the ending, that's kind of all I'll say, is the ending is not something that I think you would see coming. And that was what was interesting to me, is because I've always kind of pursued different avenues of work and decisions in life of what is the best decision or the better decision to make. And I think what you end up finding at the end of this episode is different than that approach.
Wow, that is such a cliffhanger. You've got to go and listen to this episode, everybody. For now, Nick Hammond, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
I'm Karen Hidalgo, Associate Account Manager here at Bigeye. A little bit of what I do on my day-to-day is making sure projects and budgets are on track, making sure clients are happy, projects are in production, making sure just everyone is happy and we're treading along.
And do you have a player or an app that you prefer, or do you go to websites for your podcasts?
So Spotify is my primary.
Do you have a favorite genre of podcast?
Probably nonfiction. Most of the ones that I subscribe to. Definitely love thrillers. Definitely like TED Talks.
Today, you've selected an episode of a show called Lure. How did you find this podcast?
So Lure was the first podcast I ever started listening to. It was right out of college. And podcasts were starting to be very big in the market, and people were talking about it. So I went and did some research, and I said, okay, well, I've always liked thrillers, scary stuff. So I just happened to run into Lore, and turns out it's also a show, and it's also a book, which I've had the opportunity to do both. And that's kind of where my obsession with Lore started.
Now, you've selected an episode called A Stranger Among Us. Mm-hmm. Sounds a little creepy, Karen. What's it about?
So, again, one of the first episodes I listened to happened to be in Christmas time. And this particular episode deals with Santa and what he represents in the folklore of kind of other cultures and other countries. Again, kind of hinting at the scary but history of it. So it's very intriguing. It kind of gives you a campfire experience. Mm-hmm. And he's very great at providing the historical facts, and that's also a plus for me.
Right. Now, I think I'm right in saying you were born outside of the United States, as was I. Do shows like this give you kind of an extra insight into the workings of the American mind?
Absolutely. And I'm from South America, but I love everything that has to do with everything here in America. But learning about other cultures through a podcast has given me definitely that glimpse, something that I have loved the most about listening to podcasts like this.
Karen, why do you think our listeners should give this show a try?
I guess if you're looking for something different, thrillers are not for everybody. But if you like history, if you like to spice it up, if you like folklore like I do, I think it's a great episode.
So, Karen, I understand that Aaron Menke, who's the host of this show, also has other podcasts. Have you listened to those as well?
Yes, I actually have. One of them I just started listening to, Unobscured. It goes into the history of the witch trial in Salem. Again, very history. He puts his very good spin on it, gives you a lot of facts. Great. It's just a great addition to lore.
Great. Thank you, Karen. Thanks for those recommendations.
Anytime.
I'm joined today by Dominic Wilson.
Yeah, hi. I'm the senior multimedia designer here at Bigeye. I create motion graphics, 3D design and animation, as well as video editing and photography for our campaigns.
Now, I think your selection for today's podcast is a little different from some of the other folks at Bigeye.
Yeah, that's true, I suppose. It is in the creative field in regards to software and design. So for me, I just am extraordinarily fascinated by those topics.
You have selected an episode of a show called Grayscale Gorilla Podcast. And I should explain that the description is a show for creatives who want to learn about motion design, 3D rendering, cinema 4D, working with clients, and much more. So how did you find this podcast?
I've been a fan of Nick Campbell going back to his Creamy Orange portfolio days. And then he began creating just sort of little tips and tutorials, teaching you how to do things in software or a program called After Effects. And then he just started doing libraries of tutorials on a 3D application called Cinema 4D. And I was just hooked.
Could you just give us an overview of what's in the particular podcast episode that we're linking to in the show notes today?
This particular episode spoke with Russ Gauthier, who works with a software program called Houdini. And it was interesting to hear the insights, whether or not it's something that you have to learn as a motion designer. It's kind of nice to hear someone who's seasoned kind of break it down for you.
Now, this is an audio podcast describing software. How well do you think it translates to an audio format?
Well, I think anyone who would probably seek out this particular podcast is probably going to have somewhat of a hands-on working knowledge of the program already. They do provide a lot of very helpful links to see the work that the artist did. They have an abundance of examples and things that you can see what they're doing. And if you're familiar even in just some of the graphic design applications, there'll still be a lot of things that probably can kind of connect some dots for you.
Marvelous. Okay. What made this episode a particular favorite for you?
I simply love the artists that, in my opinion, make the unreal real. Like Russ, who was the guest on that Grayscale Gorilla episode, as well as some additional Houdini users like Joe Pascal, Eric Ferguson, and the gents over at Intagma, to name a few.
So there you go. Dominic's recommendation is the Grayscale Gorilla podcast, which will give you a peek into the world of those amazing visual effects. Dominic, thank you very much indeed for joining us today.
Yeah, no problem.
Thanks to all my colleagues here at Bigeye for contributing to this week's podcast. You can find a transcript of this episode along with a link to a Spotify playlist featuring Bigeye's top podcast picks on the In Clear Focus page at bigeyeagency.com under Insights. Just click on the button marked Podcast. You'll also find a link to our listener survey. Please take a moment to submit your thoughts about this podcast and the kind of content you'd like to hear more of in future episodes. And if you haven't already, please consider subscribing to the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, or your favorite podcast player. Thank you for listening to In Clear Focus, produced by Bigeye. I've been your host, Adrian Tennant. Until next time, goodbye.